The screen of the burner phone cracked under the trembling weight of her bloody fingers. She had one chance, one desperate plea into the void before he came back upstairs. "He broke my ribs," Cassidy typed, her breath catching on a jagged edge of pain. She hit send to a number she had memorized 5 years ago, a number belonging to the Alpha King. She expected silence. She expected death. But 3 seconds later, the screen illuminated the dark, suffocating closet. The reply was 6 words that would bathe the Red Creek Packhouse in blood. "I'm coming, and he won't survive." The Red Creek Packhouse was an architectural marvel, a sprawling estate of glass, dark oak, and polished riverstone nestled deep within the unforgiving wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. To the outside world, and even to the lower-ranking wolves of the pack, it was a symbol of prosperity and strength. To Cassidy, it was a mausoleum. For 3 years, Cassidy had played the role of the perfect Luna to Alpha Declan. Declan was a man carved from marble, possessing a charismatic smile that could disarm a room and a ruthless political cunning that had elevated Red Creek to one of the most powerful factions on the West Coast. He was beloved by his people, respected by his peers, and utterly, irredeemably monstrous behind closed doors. The escalation of his abuse had not been a sudden explosion, but a slow, methodical tightening of a noose. It began with isolation. Declan systematically severed Cassidy's ties with her childhood friends, intercepting letters and manufacturing feuds until she had no one left. Then came the psychological torment, the gaslighting, the quiet whispers in the dark that she was inadequate, that without him, she was a rogue waiting to be hunted. Finally, when her spirit was sufficiently fractured, the physical violence began. Because of werewolf healing, the bruises faded quickly, a biological curse that erased the evidence of his crimes almost as soon as they were committed. Declan knew exactly how hard to hit, where to strike to cause maximum agony without leaving permanent scars that the pack elders might question. He was an artist of suffering, and Cassidy was his canvas. The night her ribs shattered began like any other diplomatic obligation. Alpha Wyatt, a neighboring leader from the Ironwood pack, had come to negotiate border hunting rights. During the formal dinner, Wyatt, a jovial and observant man, had engaged Cassidy in a discussion about regional wolf history. Cassidy, starved for intellectual stimulation, had spoken passionately, her eyes lighting up for the first time in months. Wyatt had smiled, complimenting her sharp mind and offering a respectful toast to Red Creek's brilliant Luna. Across the mahogany table, Declan had raised his glass, his smile flawless, his posture relaxed. But Cassidy saw the subtle twitch in his jaw. She saw the familiar, icy deadness in his amber eyes. Her stomach plummeted. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that she was going to pay for Wyatt's compliment. The moment the heavy oak doors of their private suite clicked shut later that evening, the illusion of the benevolent Alpha vanished. "Did you enjoy making a fool of me?" Declan's voice was barely a whisper, a low, guttural vibration that made the hairs on Cassidy's arms stand up. He didn't yell. Yelling implied a loss of control, and Declan was always in control. "Declan, please, we were only talking about the northern migration routes," Cassidy stammered, backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains of the bedroom window. "You undermined me." He unbuttoned his cuffs, his movements slow, deliberate. "You prattled on like a desperate pup trying to impress a stranger, making it look as though I cannot control my own mate. You made me look weak, Cassidy." "I didn't." He crossed the room with unnatural speed. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her throat, lifting her toes off the plush carpet. The sudden lack of oxygen sent a wave of panic through her system. Her hands clawed at his iron grip, but she was a standard wolf. Against a prime alpha, she was essentially powerless. He slammed her against the wall, the impact knocking the remaining air from her lungs. Then, he dropped her. As Cassidy crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, Declan delivered a single, devastating kick to her left side. The sound was sickening, a sharp, wet snap that echoed in the cavernous room. Agony, white-hot and blinding, flared through Cassidy's torso. Her vision whited out, and a strangled, wordless scream tore from her throat. She tasted copper. 3 fractured, 1 completely broken, Declan noted clinically, crouching down beside her. He reached out and gently, mockingly, stroked her hair. "They will heal by tomorrow evening if you rest. But until then, every breath you take will remind you of who you belong to. You do not speak for Red Creek. You do not think for Red Creek. You only exist because I allow it." He stood up, adjusting his tailored vest. "I am going downstairs for a drink. Clean yourself up before I return, or I will break the right side too." The door clicked shut, locking from the outside. Cassidy lay on the floor, paralyzed by pain. Every shallow intake of air felt like a jagged knife twisting in her chest. The healing process of a werewolf was usually a rapid, internal knitting of tissue and bone, but when bones were misaligned, the body healed them wrong, requiring them to be rebroken. She had to move, dragging herself across the floor, leaving a faint smear of blood from where she had bitten her lip. Cassidy forced herself toward the massive walk-in closet. Hidden behind a loose baseboard at the very back, beneath her winter boots, was a small prepaid burner phone. She had secured it a year ago through a bribed human servant, keeping it charged for an emergency she was too terrified to actually define. Tonight was the emergency. Tonight, she knew, if she stayed, he would eventually kill her. Her trembling, bloodied fingers retrieved the small plastic device. She huddled in the deepest corner of the dark closet, the heavy smell of Declan's cedar and musk cologne surrounding her like a physical weight. She turned the phone on. The faint glow illuminated her tear-streaked face. She opened a blank text message. She had only one number memorized. It wasn't the police. Human authorities had no jurisdiction over Packlands. It wasn't her family. They would be slaughtered. It was a number given to her 5 years ago in Geneva, Switzerland, during the Global Lichen Summit. She remembered the freezing air on the balcony, escaping the suffocating politics of the ballroom. She remembered the man who had stepped out beside her, Andrew. He wasn't just an alpha. He was the Alpha King, the sovereign ruler of the North American territories. He was a man of terrifying reputation. Yet when he had looked at Cassidy, his eyes held a profound, inexplicable sorrow and a strange reverence. They had spoken for an hour under the stars. He had recognized the sorrow in her, the chains of her political betrothal to Declan. Before they parted, he had slipped a heavy, embossed business card into her hand. "There may come a day when the golden cage loses its shine," Andrew had murmured, his voice a low rumble that had sent a shiver down her spine. "If the man who claims you forgets what a treasure you are, use this. Only once. And I will answer." Cassidy had kept the number burned into her memory. For 5 years, she had convinced herself it was just a fleeting kindness from a powerful man. Why would the king care about the domestic disputes of a provincial Luna? But as the agonizing fire consumed her chest, desperation overrode logic. "He broke my ribs," she typed. She hit send. The closet was dead silent, save for the ragged, shallow wheezing of Cassidy's breathing. She stared at the screen, the little delivered status burning into her retinas. Seconds stretched into eternities. The pain in her ribs was mutating. Her accelerated healing was kicking in. But because she hadn't been able to set the bones properly, the fractured edges were grinding together as the tissue tried to fuse. It was an excruciating, blinding agony. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The screen flashed. A text bubble appeared. "I'm coming, and he won't survive." Cassidy dropped the phone as if it had caught fire. A jolt of electricity, cold and sharp, shot straight down her spine. The words weren't a promise of sanctuary. They were a declaration of war. Andrew, the Alpha King, the man whose mere name made regional alphas lower their eyes, had not just acknowledged her, he had sentenced her mate to death. Panic, colder and more paralyzing than her fear of Declan, seized her. What had she done? By reaching out, she hadn't just asked for a rescue. She had triggered an avalanche that would rip the Red Creek pack apart. If Declan found out, he wouldn't just beat her. He would tear her throat out before Andrew ever crossed the state line. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, measured, predatory. Declan was returning. Cassidy scrambled to push the burner phone back behind the baseboard, her movements frantic and clumsy. Every twist of her torso sent a fresh wave of nausea washing over her. She shoved the wood panel back into place just as the heavy lock on the bedroom door tumbled open. She barely had time to drag herself out of the closet and slump against the foot of the massive 4-poster bed. She kept her head down, clutching her side, playing the part of the broken, subservient mate. Declan entered, smelling faintly of bourbon. He carried a silver tray with a glass of water and 2 white pills. He walked over to her, his expression a chilling mask of faux sympathy. This was the part of the cycle she hated most, the immediate aftermath. The twisted caregiving where he pretended the violence was an unfortunate necessity that hurt him as much as it hurt her. "Cassidy, sweetheart," he cooed, kneeling beside her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. She flinched, unable to suppress the instinctual reaction. His jaw tightened momentarily, but he maintained his soft tone. You know I hate it when you force my hand. But a pack must have discipline. A Luna must show respect. He held out the pills. Painkillers. Take them. The healing will be rough tonight. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She extended a trembling hand, took the pills, and swallowed them dry. Declan sighed, a heavy theatrical sound. Let's get you into bed. He hooked his arms under her knees and behind her back. Cassidy bit down on the inside of her cheek so hard she drew blood, stifling the scream that begged to erupt as he lifted her. Her broken ribs shifted, scraping against each other. He laid her on the mattress, pulling the heavy down comforter over her shivering frame. Sleep, he commanded softly, kissing her forehead. It felt like the kiss of a serpent. Tomorrow, you will smile for the pack, and we will move past this. He walked to the adjacent bathroom, leaving the door cracked open. The sound of running water filled the room. Cassidy lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The painkillers were doing nothing to dull the physical agony, but her mind was spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I'm coming. Where was Andrew? The royal seat was in New York. If he was flying, it would take hours. If he was driving, days. Would he send an emissary? An execution squad? As she lay there, the door to the bedroom slowly creaked open. Cassidy's breath hitched. But it wasn't Declan returning from the bathroom. It was Fiona. Fiona was the pack's head Omegas, and one of the few people in the house who knew the extent of what happened behind the Alpha's closed doors. She was a frail, older woman, with kind eyes and a permanent limp from a skirmish decades ago. She slipped into the room like a ghost, carrying a small basin of warm water and a rag. Seeing Cassidy pale and writhing under the blankets, Fiona's face crumpled. She hurried to the bedside, her scent a soothing blend of chamomile and old paper. "Oh, my sweet girl," Fiona breathed, setting the basin down on the nightstand. "Where did he get you this time?" "Ribs," Cassidy managed to choke out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Fiona, it's bad. I think they're setting wrong." Fiona's hands hovered over Cassidy's side, her touch incredibly gentle. She closed her eyes, letting her low-level healing energy wash over the area to assess the damage. She gasped softly. "They are splintered, Luna. If they fuse like this, you'll be in agony for weeks, and we'll have to re-break them." "I can't," Cassidy sobbed quietly, terrified Declan would hear them over the running water in the bathroom. "I can't do it again." Fiona grabbed the warm rag and gently wiped the sweat and blood from Cassidy's face. "I have some stronger herbs downstairs. Wolf's Bane-laced sedatives. It will knock you out while they heal. I'll sneak them up." "Fiona, wait." Cassidy grabbed the older woman's wrist. Her grip was weak but desperate. "Don't go back downstairs. Stay in your quarters. Lock the door." Fiona frowned, confused. "Luna? What are you talking about?" Cassidy swallowed hard, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dark, blooming hope. "A storm is coming, Fiona. A terrible storm. And I don't want you caught in the rain." Before Fiona could ask what she meant, the bathroom water shut off. Fiona's eyes widened in fear. She snatched the basin and practically dissolved into the shadows, slipping out the bedroom door just as Declan emerged, a towel slung around his waist. He paused, sniffing the air. His brow furrowed. "Was someone in here?" "No," Cassidy lied, her voice raspy. "Just me." Declan walked slowly to the side of the bed, his amber eyes scanning the shadows. He leaned over her, his nose inches from hers, inhaling deeply. "You smell like fear, Cassidy. More than usual. And something else. Anticipation?" He grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her jaw. "What have you done?" "Nothing," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm just in pain." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, searching her eyes for deception. Finally, he released her, scoffing. Pathetic. He climbed into the bed beside her, turning his back to her. Within minutes, the steady, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping predator filled the room. Cassidy did not sleep. She lay perfectly still, enduring the torture of her misaligned ribs knitting themselves back together, counting the seconds, the minutes, the hours. She waited for the sun. She waited for the king. Morning broke over the Red Creek territory, casting long, bloody shadows through the towering pine trees. Cassidy was forced out of bed at 6 a.m. The healing process had finished during the night, but just as Fiona had warned, the bones had fused improperly. There was a dull, constant ache in her side, and every deep breath felt like a tight metal band squeezing her chest. Declan was in high spirits. He stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting his tie. "We have the pack assembly in the courtyard at 8, he announced, not looking at her. "Wear the high-necked blue dress. It brings out your eyes. And use a little extra makeup. You look pale." He was entirely oblivious to the ticking clock. He thought he was untouchable. Cassidy dressed mechanically, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of the blue silk dress. She applied the makeup, hiding the dark circles under her eyes, painting on the mask of the serene, devoted Luna. Her mind was a chaotic swirl of doubt. Had Andrew really meant it? Was it a cruel joke? Maybe someone else had his phone. Maybe he had forgotten who she was and simply sent a generic threat to amuse himself. By 8 o'clock, the courtyard was filled with over 300 wolves. The morning air was crisp and biting. Cassidy stood at Declan's left side on the elevated stone dais, looking out at the sea of faces. These were her people, yet they were strangers. They saw her suffering, smelled her distress, and did nothing. Loyalty to the Alpha superseded all morality. Declan stepped forward to the microphone, raising his hands. The murmurs of the crowd instantly died down. "My brothers and sisters," Declan began, his voice booming across the courtyard, rich with manufactured warmth. "We gather today to celebrate the prosperity of Red Creek. Our borders are secure, our pups are healthy, and our alliances grow stronger by the day." He turned and smiled at Cassidy, a sickening display of affection. "And I have my beautiful Luna to thank for standing by my side, a beacon of grace for us all." The pack erupted into applause. Cassidy forced a tight, brittle smile, her heart hammering against her improperly healed ribs. Then, it happened. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a sensation. A sudden, suffocating pressure descended upon the courtyard, as if the gravity had suddenly been turned up by 100 degrees. It was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating aura that made it instantly impossible to draw a full breath. Cassidy gasped, grabbing the edge of the stone podium to keep from collapsing. In the courtyard, wolves began to drop. The weaker Omegas fell to their knees first, clutching their chests, vomiting onto the cobblestones from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the dominant energy flooding the area. Even the seasoned warriors, the beta males who made up Declan's elite guard, staggered, their knees buckling as they fought the instinct to expose their throats in absolute submission. The birds in the trees went entirely silent. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Declan's charismatic smile vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated shock. He gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning white. He was an alpha, used to projecting his own aura to control his pack. But whatever was approaching was so vastly superior to him that his own wolf spirit whimpered and clawed at the inside of his mind, demanding he kneel. "Guards!" Declan roared, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar panic. "Perimeter report!" "What is happening?" There was no answer from the earpieces of his security detail. The snipers on the roof had already abandoned their posts, incapacitated by the paralyzing fear rolling off the forest line. Then came the sound. It wasn't a fleet of helicopters or an army marching. It was the low, synchronized hum of high-end engines. 4 massive, matte black armored SUVs breached the tree line at the edge of the estate. They didn't stop at the security gates. The lead vehicle simply accelerated, smashing through the heavy iron-wrought gates as if they were made of matchsticks. The gates tore off their hinges with a screech of twisting metal, crashing onto the driveway. The vehicles rolled into the courtyard, the sea of kneeling wolves parting frantically to let them through. They moved with terrifying precision, coming to a halt in a perfect semicircle at the base of the dais. Declan stepped in front of Cassidy, his eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and terror. His fangs descended, his eyes flashing a bright defensive amber. "Who dares intrude on Red Creek territory?" he bellowed, trying to project strength he clearly didn't possess. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison. A dozen men stepped out. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore tailored black suits, but their movements were liquid, predatory. These weren't just guards. These were royal enforcers, the most lethal wolves on the continent. They didn't even look at Declan. They merely formed a perimeter around the second vehicle. The rear door of the second SUV opened. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the world. Andrew stepped out. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He wore a simple black trench coat over a charcoal suit. But it wasn't his size that was terrifying, it was the absolute stillness of his being. He had dark, raven black hair, slightly graying at the temples, and a face carved from granite. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Cassidy's lungs. They were a piercing, luminescent silver, not gray, Not blue, pure, glowing silver, the mark of a true, ancient bloodline. As Andrew closed the car door, the aura in the courtyard spiked, an invisible shockwave that forced Declan down onto one knee. The proud alpha of Red Creek hit the stone dais with a heavy thud, gasping, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought his own biology, trying desperately to stand back up. Andrew didn't look at the hundreds of bowing wolves. He didn't look at the massive pack house. He didn't even look at Declan, who was struggling to rise. Andrew's silver eyes immediately found Cassidy. Across the distance, his gaze locked onto hers. The sorrow she had seen in Geneva 5 years ago was gone. In its place was a cold, apocalyptic fury. He noted the paleness of her skin, the slight hitch in her posture where she favored her left side, the shadow of fear that still lingered behind her eyes. A low growl rumbled in Andrew's chest. It wasn't loud, but the frequency vibrated through the ground, vibrating in the bones of every wolf present. Andrew took a step forward, his voice cutting through the silent courtyard like a scythe. "I received a message," the Alpha King said, his silver eyes finally drifting down to the kneeling Declan. "And I have come to collect the man who dared to break what belongs to me." The silence that followed Andrew's decree was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the crisp morning air of the Cascade Mountains. The hundreds of wolves packed into the courtyard remained perfectly still, their foreheads pressed against the cold cobblestones, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating weight of the Alpha King's aura. On the elevated stone dais, Alpha Declan was on one knee, his face a portrait of twisting agony and humiliated rage. Veins bulged along his neck as he fought the biological imperative to submit. He was a proud man, a brutal dictator used to absolute obedience, and being forced to kneel in front of his entire pack was a psychological torture he could barely comprehend. "King Andrew?" Declan choked out, his voice a strangled rasp. He managed to lift his head, his amber eyes bloodshot and wide with forced defiance. "This is Red Creek territory. You have no jurisdiction over internal pack disputes. By the Treaty of Geneva, Aluna's discipline is the sole right of her alpha." Andrew didn't shout. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his voice was a low, seismic rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "You speak of treaties to a man who wrote them, Declan, and you speak of discipline to mask your butchery." Andrew took another step forward, closing the distance between the armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class SUVs and the stone dais. His royal enforcers moved with him in perfect, silent synchronization. The captain of the enforcers, a scarred, towering man named Gideon, stepped up beside the king, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a heavy, silver-forged blade at his hip. Declan's gaze darted frantically toward his elite beta guards, stationed around the perimeter of the courtyard. "Defend your alpha!" he roared, a pathetic edge of panic bleeding into his command. "I invoke the sovereign right of defense. Kill the intruders!" Not a single wolf moved. The betas whimpered, pressing their bodies harder against the ground. To attack a royal enforcer was suicide. To attack the Alpha King was to invite the wrath of the gods. The loyalty Declan had ruled with was rooted in fear, and right now, the king was infinitely more terrifying. Cassidy stood frozen at the edge of the dais, her hand clutching her side. Her improperly fused ribs screamed in protest with every shallow breath, but the physical pain was eclipsed by the sheer, overwhelming unreality of the moment. Andrew was here. He had actually come. She looked at the king, taking in the immaculate tailoring of his dark suit, the cold, luminescent silver of his eyes. He was a god of war stepping into her personal hell. Andrew's eyes flicked to Cassidy for a fraction of a second. He saw the way she held her side. He saw the hollow terror that years of abuse had carved into her cheekbones. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only outward sign of the monstrous fury boiling beneath his composed exterior. "She is my mate," Declan spat, finally managing to force himself to his feet, though he stood with a heavy, humiliating slouch under the pressure of Andrew's aura. "She is bound to me by the goddess. You cannot take her. If you try, the bond will tear her mind apart. You would kill her just to spite me." "The bond," Andrew said softly, ascending the first stone step of the dais, "is a sacred tether meant to protect and cherish. You have weaponized it. You have turned a gift from the goddess into a collar." Andrew reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He withdrew a single folded sheet of thick cream paper. He didn't open it. He simply held it between his fingers. "At 11:42 last night, I received a message. 6 words. He broke my ribs," she wrote. A collective gasp echoed through the kneeling pack. The lower-ranking wolves, the Omegas who whispered in the kitchens. the mothers who hid their pups when Declan walked by. They all knew, instinctively, that it was true. The pristine illusion of Red Creek was shattering. Declan's face drained of color, his charismatic facade totally crumbling. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Cassidy. "She is a liar. She is mentally unstable. She fell during a hunt. Do not insult my intelligence." Andrew cut him off, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with lethal intent. "I can smell your cruelty on her skin. I can hear the grinding of her bones from where I stand because you didn't even grant her the mercy of a proper healing setting. You are not an alpha, Declan. You are a coward who breaks fragile things because you are too weak to build strong ones." Declan's survival instinct finally overrode his political cunning. He realized, with absolute certainty, that Andrew had not come to negotiate, nor to arrest him. He had come to execute him. With a deafening, guttural roar, Declan shifted. It was a violent, explosive transformation. The tailored suit tore into shreds as massive, sand-colored fur erupted from his skin. Bones cracked and elongated, muscles expanding with supernatural speed. Within seconds, a massive timber wolf, nearly the size of a small horse, stood on the dais. Declan's wolf form was terrifying, heavily scarred from territorial disputes, his jaws dripping with venomous saliva. He lunged. Cassidy screamed, stumbling backward, her ankle twisting on the uneven stone. But Andrew did not shift. He didn't even brace himself. As the massive beast hurtled through the air, jaws snapping toward the king's throat, Andrew simply raised his right hand. He caught Declan by the throat midair. The sheer, impossible physics of it defied logic. Andrew, remaining in his human form, absorbed the kinetic impact of an 800-pound dire wolf with the casual ease of a man catching a tossed ball. Declan choked, his massive paws clawing frantically at Andrew's forearm, but his claws couldn't pierce the king's skin. Andrew's grip was absolute, an iron vice fueled by ancient sovereign blood. "I told her you wouldn't survive," Andrew whispered, his silver eyes flashing with a blinding, ethereal light. With a brutal, dismissive flick of his wrist, Andrew slammed the massive wolf onto the stone floor of the dais. The impact cracked the granite. Before Declan could scramble to his feet, Andrew drove his heel down onto the wolf's spine. The sickening crack echoed off the surrounding mountains. Declan let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, a sound so pitiful and broken that it made the surrounding pack whimper in collective horror. The massive wolf thrashed wildly, but his hind legs were completely dead, paralyzed instantly. Andrew knelt beside the flailing beast. He grabbed Declan's massive snout with one hand, forcing the wolf to look into his silver eyes. "The reign of Red Creek's tyrant ends today," Andrew declared, his voice carrying absolute authority. "By the right of the crown, I strip you of your title, I strip you of your land, and I strip you of your life." Andrew's hand shifted from the snout to the top of the wolf's head. He didn't use a blade. He didn't draw out the suffering. With one sharp, brutally efficient twist, he snapped the alpha's neck. Declan's massive body went entirely limp, collapsing onto the fractured stone. The golden tyrant of the Pacific Northwest was dead. The moment Declan's life extinguished, a secondary invisible shockwave ripped through the courtyard. For Cassidy, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like being electrocuted from the inside out. The mate bond, a deep physiological tether anchored in the soul of every werewolf, snapped violently. Because Declan was dead, the severing wasn't a slow fade. It was an amputation without anesthesia. Cassidy gasped, her eyes rolling back into her head as a blinding, white-hot agony exploded in her chest. It felt as though an invisible hook had caught her heart and violently ripped it out of her ribcage. The trauma of the severed bond, combined with the agonizing pressure of her improperly fused ribs, was too much for her fragile system to bear. She collapsed, her knees buckling beneath her. She didn't hit the stone. Before the enforcers could even twitch, Andrew moved. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, he crossed the dais and caught her. He dropped to his knees, cradling her small, trembling body against his chest. "Cassidy!" Andrew commanded, his voice suddenly stripped of all its cold, sovereign fury. It was raw, urgent, and laced with a deep, thrumming panic. "Breathe. Focus on my voice. Breathe." Cassidy couldn't breathe. Her body was convulsing, her hands clutching at the lapels of Andrew's dark coat. She was drowning in the psychic backwash of the broken bond, her mind flooded with static and phantom pain. She coughed, a thin spray of blood misting her pale lips. "Gideon!" Andrew roared over his shoulder, his silver eyes wide with terror as he looked down at her. "Get Harrison! Now!" Gideon was already sprinting toward the third SUV. The doors flew open, and a tall, bespectacled man-doctor, Harrison, the royal physician, rushed out, clutching a heavy, silver-plated medical trauma kit. Andrew carefully laid Cassidy on the stone, keeping her head elevated on his knee. He didn't care that the blood pooling from Declan's corpse was seeping into his trousers. He didn't care that hundreds of wolves were watching the king of the continent act like a desperate, terrified human. He only cared about the woman gasping for air in his arms. Dr. Harrison dropped to his knees beside them, instantly tearing open Cassidy's high-necked blue dress to access her chest. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. "Her heart rate is erratic, sire," Harrison reported, his hands moving with clinical precision. He pressed his palms gently against her left side. Cassidy let out a blood-curdling scream, her body arching off the ground. Harrison recoiled, his face grim. "The bond shock is causing extreme muscle spasms, but that's not the immediate danger. Her ribs. King Andrew, they healed out of alignment. The spasms from the broken bond are forcing the jagged, fused bone directly into her left lung. If she keeps convulsing, she'll puncture it." Andrew's jaw locked. The air around him dropped 10 degrees, frost forming on the edges of the stone dais. "Fix it, Harrison. I have to re-break them, sire. Right now. If I transport her like this, the vibration of the convoy could kill her. But her system is already in shock from the mate bond severing, the pain of shattering her ribs again. It might stop her heart." "Do it," Andrew commanded, his voice trembling slightly. He looked down at Cassidy, whose eyes were fluttering shut, her skin ashen. "I won't let her die. Do what you have to do." Andrew gathered Cassidy fully into his arms, shifting her so she was sitting up, her back pressed tightly against his broad chest. He wrapped his massive, muscular arms around her torso, acting as a human vice to keep her completely immobilized. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her faint scent of vanilla and rain, now overwhelmed by the metallic tang of blood and fear. "Listen to me, Cassidy," Andrew whispered against her ear, his voice a desperate plea. "I know it hurts. I know you are terrified. But you have to stay with me. Do not let go. I crossed an ocean and a continent for you. I will not let you leave me now." Dr. Harrison pulled a thick, leather-bound bite guard from his kit. "Open, Luna," he instructed softly. Cassidy, barely conscious, parted her lips. Harrison slid the guard between her teeth. He then positioned his hands over the malformed, fused bones on her left side. He looked up at Andrew, seeking the final confirmation. Andrew nodded, tightening his grip, his own eyes squeezing shut. Harrison pressed down with his full body weight, channeling a burst of concentrated alpha-kinetic energy into his palms. The sound was horrifying, a wet, heavy crunch as the incorrectly fused bones were violently shattered. Cassidy's body went completely rigid. She bit down on the leather guard so hard her gums bled. A muffled, inhuman shriek tore from her throat, muffled by the leather. Her hands clawed violently at Andrew's arms, her nails digging into his skin. Then, she went entirely limp, her head falling back against Andrew's shoulder. She had passed out from the pain. "Bones are reset," Harrison panted, immediately pulling a syringe filled with a thick, amber liquid from his kit. Injecting a high-grade lichen sedative and cellular accelerator, it will force a proper, rapid healing sleep while keeping her heart rate stable. He plunged the needle into her thigh. Almost instantly, the shallow, erratic wheezing of her breath deepened into a steady, narcotic rhythm. Andrew sat there for a long moment, simply holding her. The absolute silence of the courtyard returned, save for the wind howling through the pines. He slowly stood up, gathering Cassidy into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. Her head rested against his chest, her pale face peaceful in its chemically induced oblivion. Andrew turned his gaze back to the kneeling pack of Red Creek. "Your alpha is dead," Andrew proclaimed, his voice echoing with cold finality. "As of this moment, the Red Creek pack is under the direct jurisdiction of the Royal Crown. Captain Gideon will remain here with a detachment to establish martial law, audit your ranks, and find every wolf who aided, abetted, or ignored the torture of this woman." His silver eyes swept over the terrified crowd, pausing on the few beta guards who had enabled Declan's reign. "Pray to whatever gods you believe in that my enforcers find you before I decide to return." From the shadows of the packhouse doors, a frail figure limped forward. It was Fiona. She carried a small, battered duffel bag. She ignored the heavily armed enforcers, her eyes fixed solely on Cassidy's unconscious form. "Her things, Your Majesty," Fiona said, her voice trembling but resolute as she stopped before the king. "It is only a few books, her mother's blanket, and some winter clothes, but they are hers." Andrew looked at the old Omega. He could sense the faint residue of healing magic on her hands. He knew, instinctively, that this woman was the only reason Cassidy had survived the night. "What is your name?" Andrew asked, his tone softening a fraction. "Fiona, sire." "Gather your own things, Fiona," Andrew commanded. "You are coming with us. The royal seat is in need of a head of staff who understands loyalty." Fiona's eyes widened, tears instantly pooling in their corners. She bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty." Andrew turned and carried Cassidy toward the open door of his armored SUV. He laid her gently across the plush leather of the back seat, sliding in beside her and resting her head on his lap. "Doctor." Harrison climbed into the front passenger seat. "Drive," Andrew ordered the driver. The engines roared to life. The convoy turned, leaving the broken body of the tyrant bleeding on the stones, and sped back through the shattered iron gates, disappearing into the dense, foggy tree line of the Pacific Northwest. The golden cage was broken. The real storm was just beginning. The scent of blood and damp earth was gone, replaced by the subtle, comforting aroma of cedarwood, old parchment, and a faint hint of rain. Cassidy opened her eyes to a ceiling of intricately carved mahogany. She was lying in the center of a massive, four-poster bed draped in thick, charcoal gray velvet. The mattress beneath her felt like a cloud, a stark contrast to the hard, unforgiving reality she had known for 3 years. Panic, a conditioned reflex, spiked in her chest. She gasped, bracing for the agonizing pull of her shattered ribs. Nothing happened. Her breath came easily, filling her lungs with smooth, unobstructed perfection. Her hands flew to her left side. The skin was flawless. No bruising, no jagged protrusions. "Careful, child," a soft, familiar voice murmured from the corner of the room. Cassidy turned her head to see Fiona sitting in a plush leather armchair, a cup of steaming tea in her hands. The old Omega looked rested, the deep lines of stress around her eyes remarkably softer. Beyond her, massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a sprawling manicured estate blanketed in the lush greenery of the Hudson Valley. "Fiona," Cassidy breathed, her voice raspy from disuse. "Where are we?" "The royal seat. Luna. The king's private estate in Rhinebeck, New York," Fiona replied, setting the tea down and moving to the bedside. "You have been asleep for 4 days. Doctor, Harrison's sedatives did their work. Your ribs are perfectly healed, and the shock of the severed bond has passed. 4 days." The memory of the courtyard crashed over her like a tidal wave, the crushing aura, Declan's monstrous wolf form, the sickening crack of his spine, the blinding agony in her chest. Declan was dead. The tyrant of the Pacific Northwest, the man who had turned her life into a waking nightmare, was gone. Before Cassidy could process the monumental weight of her freedom, the heavy oak door to the suite clicked open. Andrew stepped inside. He had traded his armored trench coat for a simple, tailored navy button-down and dark slacks, but the casual attire did nothing to diminish the terrifying, magnetic gravity of his presence. His luminescent silver eyes immediately found hers, and the air in the room seemed to warm by several degrees. Fiona bowed deeply and silently slipped out of the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Andrew stood at the foot of the bed, his large hands resting on the carved wooden footboard. For a moment, the Alpha King, the most lethal predator on the continent, looked almost hesitant. "How do you feel, Cassidy?" he asked, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Like I died and woke up in someone else's life," she whispered, pulling the heavy velvet comforter up to her chin. "You killed him. You actually killed him." "I executed a monster who was masquerading as an alpha," Andrew corrected, his jaw tightening. "But my actions have set a fire across the continent. You need to understand the reality of our situation." He walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. Declan was not just an abusive mate. He was a traitor. "We have spent the last 4 days tearing through Red Creek's private servers. We discovered that he was bypassing the Lycan Council and selling vast tracts of pack territory to human developers, specifically a massive shell corporation known as the Oakhaven Trust, backed by Senator Arthur Croft. Cassidy's eyes widened. Senator Croft was a household name, a ruthless human politician known for his aggressive industrial expansion policies. If werewolves were exposed to a man like that, it would mean war. Declan was arming a private rogue militia using human funding, Andrew continued, turning back to face her. He was preparing to challenge the crown. I suspected his treason for over a year, but under the Geneva Accords, I could not legally breach his borders without absolute proof or a direct invocation of the right of sanctuary from a ranking pack member. The realization hit Cassidy with the force of a physical blow. My text message. Yes, Andrew said softly. Your message gave me the legal jurisdiction to invade Red Creek, dismantle a domestic terrorist threat, and execute a traitor before he could ignite a war with the human government. Cassidy felt a sudden, cold, hollow form in her stomach. The romantic illusion of the king riding to her rescue fractured. So, I was just a loophole? A convenient key to unlock your political obstacle? Andrew's expression shattered. In a blur of movement, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his massive hands reaching out to gently cup her face. The raw, desperate intensity in his silver eyes took her breath away. No, he said, his voice fierce and trembling. No, Cassidy. The politics were the excuse I needed to appease the council, but you were the reason I tore those gates down. 5 years ago in Geneva, Andrew murmured, his thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones. I knew the moment you stepped onto that balcony, the scent of rain and vanilla, the pull in my chest. You were my true mate. Cassidy stopped breathing. True mates were a myth, a bedtime story told to pups to make the political, arranged marriages of high society seem less clinical. If you knew, she choked out, tears suddenly prickling her eyes. Why did you leave me with him? Why did you let him break me? Andrew closed his eyes, a look of profound, agonizing guilt washing over his features. Because the bond was a one-way recognition. You were already marked by Declan. Lichen law is absolute if a king challenges a seated alpha for a claimed mate without her explicit consent. It is considered an act of tyrannical conquest. It would have triggered a civil war. Thousands would have died, and the council would have ordered your execution to prevent the conflict. He opened his eyes, the silver glowing with an ancient, deeply rooted sorrow. I had to let you go. It was the greatest failure of my life. I gave you that phone, praying to the goddess you would never need it, but knowing the monster you were tethered to. When your message came through, he took a shuddering breath. When I read those words, the king vanished. Only the mate remained. I would have burned the entire West Coast to ash to reach you. Cassidy stared at him, the walls of her trauma and mistrust trembling under the weight of his absolute devotion. The man before her wasn't a cold, calculating politician using her for leverage. He was a fiercely protective force of nature, who had spent half a decade waiting in the dark for her to simply call his name. The Southern factions are outraged, Andrew admitted, his tone sobering. They are demanding an inquiry into Declan's death. They believe I am consolidating power. Tomorrow, the council will convene here at the estate. They will demand you testify about the abuse, and they will try to use your trauma to discredit my intervention. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black velvet box. He didn't open it, but gently placed it in her hands. I can give you a new identity, Andrew said softly. I have a private chalet in the Swiss Alps, heavily guarded, completely off the grid. You can go there today. You will never have to face a pack, an alpha, or a council, ever again. You will be safe, and you will be free. Cassidy looked down at the box, then up into his luminous silver eyes. And if I stay? If you stay, Andrew said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, reverent whisper. You stay as my equal, as my queen. We will face the council together, and we will show them that the crown does not flinch. But I will not trap you in another golden cage, Cassidy. The choice is entirely yours. Cassidy looked out the window at the sprawling green hills of the Hudson Valley. For 3 years, she had been a victim. She had hidden in closets, swallowed her voice, and bled on the floor of a man who saw her as property. But sitting here, breathing freely for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a new, unfamiliar spark ignited in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was defiance. She opened the small velvet box. Inside rested a breathtaking vintage ring, a massive, flawless sapphire surrounded by intricate silver filigree. It wasn't just a ring. It was the ancient seal of the Luna Royal. Cassidy didn't look away from the jewel. Her hand stopped trembling. She closed the box with a sharp, decisive snap. Tell the council to prepare themselves, Cassidy said, her voice steady, cool, and ringing with a newfound authority. She looked up, meeting the Alpha King's gaze with a fierce, unwavering fire of her own. The Queen has a lot to say. The transition from a broken victim to a sovereign power is rarely clean, and the scars of Red Creek would undoubtedly shadow Cassidy for years to come. Yet, true healing often begins the moment silence is broken. By sending a 6-word text into the void, Cassidy did not just dismantle a tyrannical regime and thwart a political conspiracy. She reclaimed her own agency. Andrew provided the sword, but Cassidy provided the spark. The Velvet Fortress of the Hudson Valley would become the staging ground for a new era in the Lycan world, one where cruelty was no longer shielded by tradition, and where a queen, once broken, learned to rule not through fear, but through the indomitable strength of her own survival.